Hello and welcome to GCSE English Revision Pod. My name is Mr. Galley.
And I'm Mr. Forster.
We are very happy to have you here again. Today we are going to move on to a completely different paper that we have not talked about before. This is for people doing AQA. However, we should say that anyone studying these texts, these podcasts will still be useful for. It would just be worth perhaps checking with your teacher or looking at how the question might be slightly differently structured to AQA. But for anyone doing AQA, this is us moving on to literature paper 2, and we are going to look at a question on a modern-ish drama called An Inspector Calls.
Yeah, we did this because one of our listeners actually sent us an email asking us to look at An Inspector Calls because that was an area that he was finding quite difficult.
Absolutely, and we are very happy to take your direction on that front. So if you have a text or a question you would like us to work on, we would very much like to hear from you. The email address is englishrevisionpod@gmail.com, and yes, drop us your suggestions and comments and we will be very happy to get to work on that.
And likewise, we said last episode, if you have any specific follow-up questions about an episode that we did, anything that wasn't clear, do drop us an email and we can always clarify that for you.
If you want to say something like, well, I think Mr. Galley's input is fantastic, but Mr. Forster's is not so good, he kind of lets it down a little bit, that's fine. Let us know those kind of things. We're always eager to.
I mean, you'd be very much in the minority if you thought that, but
Anyway, before we get too distracted, we should also say, of course, that as ever in the bio of this podcast, there is a link. If you go and click on that link or copy that link into your browser, you will be able to get the handout for this podcast, which includes the question, all the key vocabulary we use, all the key quotations from the text that we use, and also your key context, your AO3.
And a quick point on the vocabulary. I cannot emphasise enough, we've been discussing this as a department recently, how important your vocabulary is when trying to write sophisticated analysis.
Mr. Forster's been reading a book on vocabulary, which, trust me, listeners, we really do not want to get him started on. But it is absolutely right, and we would implore you to use those for your reference and your revision. So
and the spellings are all included on the sheet.
For free.
For free.
Wonderful stuff. So the question that we're going to look at then today.
Yeah, so we're looking at a question, I think it's quite a simple character question to start us off. Explore the ways in which Priestley creates sympathy for the character of Sheila in An Inspector Calls. All
right, interesting question. It's a character question. Now, I think, sir, if I can predict what some of our students are thinking, they are thinking this is one of the most difficult questions because the simple reason that you are not given an extract. Unlike paper 1, you are not given an extract for this question.
Yeah, so I think literature paper 2, obviously it is challenging for that reason, because obviously with paper 1 it's very easy. You start by analysing the extract, then you look at some other points in the text. But when looking at character questions with An Inspector Calls, at least, I think there's quite an easy way to structure them. Because of the arrival of the inspector midway through Act 1, generally you want to structure a character question around what are they like at the start of the play, before they've encountered the inspector. Then look at how do they respond to the questioning of the inspector. And then finally looking at what kind of impact does he have on them in Act 3, what are they like at the very end. And then your conclusion, really, you're focusing upon what is their function in the narrative, what is Priestley using this character for, what do they represent, how do they tie in with his didactic message about Edwardian society.
That's really interesting. So what you're saying, I suppose, is that for any character question within An Inspector Calls, apart from if the question was about the inspector himself,
or perhaps Eva Smith,
or perhaps Eva, you are basically using the same essay
Edna
plan, or Edna.
I don't think she'd come up.
The crafty Edna question, yeah, perhaps. Okay, so that means, I guess, that you're starting off your essay by talking about Sheila at the beginning of the novel. Do you want to give it, because we haven't done a pod on Inspector Calls before, do you want to give a brief overview of the text itself?
Yeah, so Priestley's play An Inspector Calls, written in 1945, and it explores the flaws of capitalism and highlights the social inequalities of pre-war Britain. So it's set in 1912. Even though it's written in 1945. It's set in a fictional industrial North Midlands town called Bromley. Mm-hmm. And it centres on the Burlings, who are an affluent, upper middle class family who are celebrating the engagement of Sheila Burling and Gerald Croft.
So when we first see this family, we're thinking, right, they've got money. They're not the aristocracy. They're not incredibly wealthy, but they've done fairly well out of life.
They're living in, I mean, the opening stage directions show that they're living a life of luxury.
They're living a life of luxury. They're celebrating an engagement. Everything seems to be good in the Burling household.
But midway through Act 1, the eponymous inspector comes on stage to tell them of the tragic suicide of a young working class girl, Eva Smith, who once worked in Mr. Burling's factory, as it transpires, before being fired, who once worked in a shop where Sheila, Mr. Burling's daughter, visited before being fired because of her complaint, who was perhaps even raped by Eric Burling, who was seduced by Gerald Croft, and who was finally rejected by Mrs. Burling when she went for help pregnant to her charity.
So as the play progresses, we find out that they all had a role to play.
Yeah, they're all implicated in her death. And this essay is focusing just on Sheila.
Okay.
So I think what we want to look at initially is how Sheila initially seems far from a sympathetic character. So what I mean by this is that the audience don't necessarily feel sorry for her.
Right,
She
okay.
seems quite puerile, quite frivolous, and quite petulant.
Okay.
So puerile means she's kind of silly, she's immature, she has frivolous, she has no serious purpose, and petulant means she's actually quite sulky. She seems quite childish and immature. Spoiled is a very good way of thinking about it.
She's a spoilt young child. She's treated differently from the men in the family, which we sort of see quite early on. But yeah, there's very little good about her at the start, isn't it? What language are you looking at to support those ideas?
So in the opening moments of the play, she addresses her mother as mummy, even though she's a woman in her early 20s. She has this childish fight with her brother, accusing him of being squiffy. That means a slang word meaning drunk, and an ass. And actually, as a result of this, this all seems indicative of her sheltered upbringing in the upper middle classes of late Edwardian Britain. She doesn't seem like she's seen the real world.
Okay, she's protected, she's sheltered, all this kind of stuff, and she's able to act like a little child, which is ironic, really, because we're seeing her getting engaged.
Yeah, but even her engagement is focused on the superficial detail of what the ring looks like. She says something like, "Is it the ring you chose me, Gerald?"
So it doesn't seem like the union is about true love and all that kind of stuff. It's more the kind of shiny, glitzy side of marriage.
And likewise, when she's questioned even by the inspector initially, and she recalls her encounter with Eva Smith in Millwoods, she's quite patronising towards her. She says that she was lucky to get taken on at all.
So her opinion was that a girl like Eva Smith was fortunate to even have a job in a shop that someone like her would go in.
Yeah, and to justify her actions against Eva Smith, complaining about her, when all Eva Smith did, in fact, was look better in a dress than Sheila would have done. She explains she was very pretty and looked like she could take care of herself. So this is a line that sets up the worldview of her kind of shallow, puerile world, that in her world, looking good, being beautiful, is synonymous with being socially safe and not in any way vulnerable.
And it's enough of a reason to hate someone as well. If someone looks better than you, then that's a reason not to like that person.
She comes across as jealous.
Bitter, unpleasant person. So the first paragraph, I suppose, our students would be perhaps looking to write is this idea that Eva does not come across very well at all at the start of the play. She comes across as this selfish, spoilt, immature young person with very little to recommend her. And in terms of the treatment of Eva, it's downright cruel, really.
And in terms of what Precy's doing, she seems to represent this class divide in late Edwardian society, but of the upper middle classes who are cut off from the realities, the brutal realities represented by Eva Smith's tragic suicide.
Right.
And I think we can move from there, however, to say even whilst the inspector interrogates the family over their involvement in Eva's suicide, it becomes clear that she's far more sympathetic than her parents. We immediately observe that she empathises with Eva Smith's plight and detests the manner of her dismissal from her father's factory, expressing how Mr. Burling's actions were unfair and that it was a mean thing to do.
That's interesting.
She even takes issue with her father's dehumanisation of Eva Smith by suggesting that the girls aren't cheap labour, they're human. I think that's a really interesting line to analyse.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I think actually the fact that she contrasts her father's view that they're cheap labour with her view that they're human, it shows, or it foreshadows, what becomes a real key theme in the play, and a key thing to talk about when analysing Sheila, which is that Sheila comes to represent the wisdom the actual what needs to be learned, what people need to start believing and thinking if the world is going to be a better place. And that is one of those first moments when we see it.
Yeah, and I think, and if looking technically this, because one challenge of analysing an inspector calls is because the language is far simpler, actually it's harder to get those high analytical marks than it is perhaps with something more complex like
right, because
Shakespeare.
the metaphors in Romeo and Juliet are so much deeper.
You can't not analyse them.
Right, yeah.
So one thing we could look at here is how, when she says the girls aren't cheap labour, they're human, she's engaging with the way in which Mr. Burling sees all of the workers in his factory. He reifies them as cheap labour. He sees them as this abstract thing, as a resource, a commodity to be used. It's quite a disturbing metaphor
their numbers
when you
on
really
the
think about
well,
it.
He wouldn't have a spreadsheet, but their numbers on a list as far as he's
Whereas
concerned.
what she acknowledges instead is their individuality. And this is even before she's learnt of her own involvement. And we see also that in her response to the inspector's description of how Eva died after several hours of agony, she says she felt rotten and can't stop thinking about it.
Okay, so straight away, when she hears about Eva Smith, we see a change start to come across her. That's why she contrasts the older generation so strongly, is because the moment the inspector tells her what happened to Eva Smith, we see a seed of change being born in Sheila.
Yeah, and by the end of Act 1, we see this kind of pronounced effect. She says it was her own fault. She also seems far less naive, and unlike her mother, she recognises that we mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between them and that girl, because the inspector will just break it down. It's a really crucial metaphor, this, I think.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And it represents more, I suppose, than just the dynamic between the Burlings and Eva Smith. The wall, I think, that Sheila is talking about is the wall between the whole of the upper classes and the working classes. You know, this idea that a wall, you can't see through it, you know, so the suffering of others, you can put it on the other side of the wall. You don't need to worry about others. You can put them out of sight and just benefit from the cheap labour.
Yeah, and in the most famous production of An Inspector Calls, which was revived over the last couple of years,
I went to see it.
The staging, in fact, emphasises this, because the whole of the play takes place. The Burlings exist in this tiny, it looks like a doll's house in the centre of the stage, and the rest of the stage is filled with craters and looks very much like the London Actually of 1945 of the Blitz, and the play ends with the house exploding, an obvious metaphor for this cosy insular world that's been walled off from the rest of society, being broken down by the two world wars, just like the class system to a certain extent was broken down by the two world wars of the first half of the 20th century.
And that was the historical sort of AO3 contextual point that can be brought in. Another thing I think you students could say about that Sheila using that metaphor there is that the inspector himself uses some quite interesting metaphors, doesn't he? Does he describe society as a chain?
He talks about the chain linking everyone together, and therefore and the suggestion therefore is that that we're connected, that there isn't this divide between the classes.
So a bit of a stretch and challenge point could perhaps be that by engaging with these kind of metaphors to describe society, Sheila's coming towards the inspector's way of thinking.
Yeah, she seems to recognise the inspector's socialist agenda and actually take on his voice. She functions almost as a mouthpiece for the inspector when he's left the stage in Act 3.
And then there's this big revelation. So I think sort of moving forward into the play, she responds quite well to the inspector's question. She starts looking at herself and taking a level of responsibility for what she did.
Yeah.
And then we come to this revelation that her husband-to-be was also involved.
Yeah, I think perhaps our final kind of paragraph before our conclusion would be looking at how, with the revelation of Gerald's infidelities in Act 2, that he has actually had a relationship with Eva Smith during a summer when he said he was too busy. Classic excuse we give to the wife. Busy at the works.
Exactly. I mean, he's Gerald's,
she seems presented in far less ambivalent terms after this. She's a very sympathetic character. She lacks power, she lacks agency in the Burling family.
Right. But she really comes out of that, doesn't she? She really starts to take control of the situation. And I think a kind of structural point that students could say is just looking at Sheila's role within the conversation. At the beginning of the play, you've got this kind of quite sort of silly, immature character who has no real role in the conversation beyond the superficial. By the end, she's interrupting, she's commanding, she's setting the agenda of the conversation.
Yeah, she becomes this proto-feminist figure.
Right. What do you mean by that?
So this is a term for women who are starting to take on feminist values, but before first wave feminism, which really kind of takes real shape with the suffragette movement and the wake of the First World War.
Which had, of course, happened before.
Yeah, it started.
Previously.
The process has started.
Yes.
And she seems, she tries to take control, and she tries to react against a world that is trying to shut her out. So, for example, when Gerald says that she should be protected from unpleasant and disturbing things, her sarcastic response is that he obviously must think that she's getting hysterical. And this is a really important word, I think, because it's a word with a misogynistic connotation, because it's implying that women act in an irrational and overexcited manner, that unlike a man, she can't handle she
should be protected.
She should be protected. She shouldn't see the reality of the world.
And of course, the deep irony there is that she's actually possibly the only character who
sees the
really
truth.
engages with it. And she's in a sense, what students might want to explore is that she's the last person who needs to be protected from it. She's in fact the only person who is reacting properly to it.
And the real misogyny of that word hysterical can be seen actually in where the word comes from. It comes from the Greek actually meaning of the womb. So the idea that being irrational in the world of later Edwardian society is associated with being a woman.
Yeah.
So I think we quite sympathise. Certainly, a modern audience very much sympathises with Sheila in this moment, because we see that although she is far-sighted, although she has had this transformation, although she, unlike her parents, has had this moral and social epiphany, recognising what was wrong with society, no one listens to her because she's a woman.
So much criticism of society in the representation of Sheila. So I think students are continually, really in every paragraph of this essay, you would be drawing on an AO3 point, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and I think in Act 3 she says that to her parents, after her parents they're kind of very happy that the inspector's left, and they find out he perhaps wasn't even a real police inspector, and she says sarcastically, "I suppose we're all nice people now," as if recognising that they haven't listened to the inspector's message.
Yeah.
They haven't learnt what Priestley wants them to have learned and what the inspector wants them to have learned.
There's that real divide at the end that you see between old and young, isn't there, at that point in time?
So a bit of a structural point here. So you can say how Priestley sets up this divide between the older generation, who are static and socially conservative in their views. They won't change. They won't accept change. And Sheila, who's been visibly shaken. The stage directions, for example, say how she shivers and she speaks tensely, while her family callously seek to move on with their lives. She even says, "It frightens me the way you talk."
Yeah, that shows the level of her transformation, doesn't it? That she's thinking of it as it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether, ultimately, of course, it would be great if the girl hadn't died, but it doesn't change anything about what they did. They still committed the bad acts. And Sheila is the only, perhaps along with Eric, is the only one who sees that actually the consequences aren't what's important. It's your intentions and your actions.
Yeah, and I think that draws us towards the conclusion, where we always want to think in the conclusion, why is Priestley constructing the character in this way? What does she represent? Because this is a play with a very clear didactic message. So that means it's teaching us something. And I think what she comes to symbolise is the younger generation that Priestley believed could change. Because, of course, her generation in 1912 would, by 1945, be the very people voting in Clement Attlee, the first Labour Prime Minister. And they are the younger generation in this play, therefore, are a representative of who Priestley, where the potential lay in the world, Priestley seems to believe.
So Priestley's saying, look, young people, you can make the world a better place. You know, the Sheilas and the Erics of the world, even though Sheila and Eric weren't great characters, and arguably you could argue for a long time about how much forgiveness they deserve or don't deserve, but they had the capacity to change and make the world a better place.
Precisely.
Right. I think that would be quite a good essay if that was put all together.
Yeah, and as I said, if any of the vocabulary there was very challenging, don't forget to go and check A, how to spell it, and B, exactly the precise meaning of the words, because I think vocabulary is key to writing a really good essay.
Yes, as we said at the start of the podcast, you can download the handout which has everything that we have talked about. If you get your podcast from Acast or iTunes, I think you can just click on the link. But for some reason on Spotify, you can't click on the link in the bio. I don't know what that is. I've been trying to sort it out, but I'm incredibly unskilled at this kind of stuff. But if you just copy and paste the link into your browser from Spotify, that will take you to the handout all the same.
Excellent. On that technical note.
Yeah, I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. As we said, EnglishRevisionPod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your suggestions of what you'd like to hear us talking about. And we will see you very soon.
In fire and blood and anguish. Good night.